How big will Kris Bubic's return be in the long run? We'll dive into it in this edition of Locked On Royals.
You are Locked On Royals, your daily Kansas City Royals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are tuned into another edition of Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. You also can catch us on wherever you get your podcast. That can be Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Google Podcast. We're on Odyssey, and we're on YouTube. Just be sure to hit that follow button and subscribe. If you are a first-time listener and want to know a little bit more about me and this show, well, I'm based here in Kansas City. I work at Sports Radio 810 WHB, doing some producing, hosting, and co-hosting in the day-to-day at my place of work. But when it comes to this podcast, when you click on this link, you're going to be getting 30 straight minutes of Royals baseball. Now, today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. As the playoffs have concluded and the sports stop sporting like we want them to, this summer we still can get you guys hooked up with FanDuel, and they're going to have all customers prepared with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So visit them at FanDuel.com to get started. We had touched on this a little bit in one of our episodes, I think on Sunday or on Monday, but the return of Kris Bubic and what it could mean for this ball club. And, you know, it feels weird, though we have the All-Star break next week where the Royals won't play for 4 days. We haven't seen the Royals play since Sunday. They had an off day on Monday. They were rained out tonight in St. Louis. They'll have a doubleheader tomorrow. And then they're going to have an off day on Thursday. So 3 off days this week for Kansas City. And then they're going to have 4 days off next week. So talk about getting all the rest that they need going into the second half of this season. If they do feel fatigued, they really will feel refreshed by the time they take on the White Sox next Friday to kick off the second half. The second half, though, is going to bring up a lot of questions for this team. And I think, you know, those questions are going to be answered sooner rather than later. I think their level of sustainability is either going to be exposed in August, or they're going to be able to prove all the doubters wrong. That their run, even though it might be 100 games, it's going to come to an end. And by the time they get to September, there's really not a playoff spot within, you know, striking distance. And it hasn't helped that Boston has caught fire. It hasn't helped that Minnesota has caught fire, that Cleveland has caught fire, that Houston has caught fire as soon as the Royals hit their cold stretch. But a lot of that cold stretch can be attributed to a few things for sure. The offense going cold, but I've always thought this bullpen has been such a glaring issue. And I was pushing it off back in April. I thought it was an up and down bullpen. I think I've even said as early as last week or two, like, this is who the bullpen is. They're going to be streaky. They're going to have their moments. And to an extent, I still believe that to be true. But I also think if the Royals are going to make a strong push in the second half, they're going to have to get creative with how they handle this bullpen. As we've said multiple times before, the Royals are not going to go out there and acquire 4 guys for their bullpen. And it seems like they believe a handful of these guys can bounce back, can have good second halves. I mean, we were ready in April to dismiss Will Smith, and then Will Smith became one of the more reliable arms in the bullpen. I mean, he had a sub-2 ERA since April, you know, going back to that series against Colorado. Then in Colorado, he got roughed up a little bit, or it might have been the Tampa Bay series that he got roughed up. Again, the point still stands that sometimes we have those knee-jerk reactions until you get 15 games down the road. And actually, that bullpen guy looked pretty good. Chris Stratton's a perfect example. He is somebody that quietly will have 8 or 9 scoreless outings, and you don't realize it, because a really important part of the bullpen is also what you do when maybe the game is within striking distance, but you're not with the lead. We only remember when the bullpen blows up, but there's some times when the Royals trail 4-1 and the bullpen throws 5 scoreless innings, but you don't remember that. What is the problem, though, is when you have those leads, when you have the 1-run lead, when you've got a 2-run lead, and you just want to get the ball to James McArthur. Right now, there is no trustworthy 7th-inning guy. There's no trustworthy 8th-inning guy. And Kris Bubic has 1 inning under his belt. Kris Bubic also, I think when it's going to come down to it in September, he's going to have some of the better stuff in the bullpen. It's a credit to Kris Bubic. It's also a knock on a bullpen that doesn't have that great of stuff. James McArthur, in my opinion, has the best stuff. Everybody else, kind of iffy or below average at that. And we'll talk about it a little bit more in the second segment. Back to my point, though, of getting creative. I believe the Royals are going to add at least 1 bullpen arm to help them bridge that gap from the 7th inning to the 8th inning and then to get to James McArthur in the 9th. It is not going to surprise me that if Kris Bubic handles the responsibility he has now, I don't think Matt Quatraro is going to throw Kris Bubic in a 7th inning spot in a 1-run game, on the road in Boston. I don't think it's going to happen that quickly. I think we will see him throw in very low leverage spots, make sure this stuff is good. But I do wonder how long they can keep him from that spot. Because if Kris Bubic is the Kris Bubic we saw last year in April, he can become your 1-inning guy in the 7th inning. It may not be the most glamorous. He may not have the best swing and miss stuff. But I think with the way he spun it last year and the 1-inning workload we saw in Colorado, it's something to consider. And it also shows you my trust level and my confidence level and the other guys in the bullpen. I mean, you tell me right now, if not Kris Bubic by the end of July, beginning of August, well, let's say Kris Bubic has 6 or 7 straight scoreless outings to begin his 2024 season. Do you get to that point at the end of July or the beginning of August and go, maybe it's worth a shot? Let's see if he can be a high leverage guy. That's the point about being a little bit more creative. Matt Quatraro has tried to get creative with this bullpen. You can't always rely on guys to be the best version of yourself when you have no swing and miss stuff. And I do wonder if Kris Bubic looks as good as he did on Sunday in the next 6 or 7 outings, you could look at him as your swing and miss guy. He's not going to throw 97, 98, 99, but the changeup can be devastating. The cutter he's been working on can be a great pitch when located perfectly. So I wonder that there could come some point in this season where you got to make that an effort. You got to give it an opportunity because John Schreiber to me is not that guy. Nick Anderson is not that guy. Angel Serpa is not that guy. Nick Anderson's not that guy. Or I already said Nick Anderson. I'm coming down on Nick Anderson a little bit too hard. Will Smith, Serpa, Chris Stratton. Throw any name out in this bullpen. Carlos Hernandez isn't there anymore. Walter Pennington isn't there. He hopefully is back. Might be the 27th man tomorrow. Who knows? But again, you have to get a little bit more creative. And at some point, you have to try it. At some point, you have to gamble. Because I don't know if I'm there anymore where the Royals have a 1-run lead or a tied going into this week, whether it's St. Louis or Boston, and they go to John Schreiber in the 8th. I don't know if I'm there anymore. I would rather see John Schreiber in a smaller role in the 6th inning. If you have a 2-1 lead, let's try it in the 6th. I know that happened in Texas, and he blew up, but you're going to have to use John Schreiber because the other guys in your bullpen just aren't going to be as reliable. I had wished that guys like Will Smith and Nick Anderson and Stratton could become those 7th inning guys, those 8th inning guys. The reality is they're not. Kris Bubic has 1 inning. And that says a lot that I'm saying Kris Bubic could become one of those guys. They're the setup guy for James McArthur. But if he's not going to start, I think it's at least worth a shot if you can't find your 7th or 8th inning guy. What value to your team does Kris Bubic provide as the long relief, low leverage guy? Yeah, you can eat some innings there and save the bullpen, but who are you saving anymore when you look to a close game, right? If the Royals go out in game 1 of this doubleheader tomorrow and they get rocked, let's say Alec Marsh gets rocked and they need to save a couple of arms for the night game. Who are you really really concerned with not using in game one so you could save him for game two? Who would it be? For me, it'd be James MacArthur, and that's about it. Everybody else should be available. And that's why I look at Kris Bubic. Yeah, it's great to save the bullpen some innings, but I want to see Kris Bubic eventually. I'm not saying immediately. Like I said, end of July, beginning of August, a month from now, when he's got 7, 8, 9, 10 innings under his belt, I think it's worth a shot in a one-inning workload. If you're going to use him for one inning and blowouts, let's see if he can handle it in a high leverage spot. I'm just saying, you got to get creative in the second half. You really do. I don't think you can keep throwing the same guys out there over and over and over again. You're eventually going to have to see if Kris Bubic can do it. And if it's anything like we saw on Sunday, I think he could become that eighth inning guy. The guy you could trust maybe to get you 3 outs and bridge the gap to James MacArthur. We'll see, though. Maybe the Royals don't want to overwork him, don't want to put him back in that spot, and the hope is that he's ready to go and healthy in 2024. It could be polar opposite what I'm thinking right now, but I at least think it has to be tried out once. I like watching Kris Bubic pitch, even if it's one inning. I like what I saw last year. I'd love to see, considering there's no 7th or 8th inning guy right now, if he could handle it one time this week. If not, let's wait till the end of the month. If he can build up his arm, look good enough, have scoreless outings, I'd like to see him in the 7th inning or the 8th inning at one point this year to see if he can handle it. But that's just one man's opinion. Okay, we're going to take our first break of the show. When we come back, I had teased this in the last 2 episodes. Who are some of the guys the Royals need to cut bait with and move on to give somebody else an opportunity? We'll tell you who next on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. Want to give a shout out to our title sponsor today in FanDuel. You guys all know that I love sports, and I love them so much that I never want them to stop. And we usually get that with sports being year-round. But as the playoffs have come to an end in the NBA, we get fewer and fewer games, though baseball, of course, is in full swing. But the sports just aren't sportsing like we want them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. And I'm going to use the same bet that I tried to give last night. Didn't think the game would get rained out last night, but since we have a doubleheader, still going to throw some money down on Michael Wacha going over 6 innings tomorrow against his former team in the St. Louis Cardinals. As I had mentioned, there are guys, as we all know, that have overstayed their welcome in Kansas City. It's the reality of Major League Baseball. As much as I would like to sit here and tell all of you guys, well, you know, I go down in the clubhouse from time to time and I see these players. I'm never going to bash a player openly unless there was a very valid reason to bash a player. Like if you are struggling and you aren't playing well, I'm not going to come on an episode and just trash the guy for 30 minutes saying what a disgrace he is. And I'm not going to do that. You can bring up bad numbers and say, hey, this can't keep flying if you're going to be an everyday player, because it's the big leagues, right? This is a business. You've heard that terminology all the time. When it's a business, if you can't do your job, somebody else is going to take it. And the Royals in the second half are in a spot they haven't been in 7 years. 2017 was the last time anything was remotely competitive in the second half. So when you have that pressure, you can't just keep waiting for guys to turn things around. Young guys, I can see, right? You know that I am a MJ Melendez apologist, but since June 7th, about a month now, MJ Melendez has been what he was in the second half, pretty much. A little bit worse than that, but much better than we saw in May, much better than we saw at the end of April. But you look at the bullpen, you look at some of the bench guys that can be easier to replace. I think you have to have some very serious conversations about guys you want to acquire and guys that could be the odd men out. I understand that when you have a winning ball club above 500, a tight clubhouse, the last thing you want to do is disrupt that. You know, who knows? I remember for years in covering the Royals, there were guys that weren't the best players, but were great clubhouse guys. That if you traded that guy away or DFA'd that guy, it was going to cause some sort of a fissure in the clubhouse or a fracturing in the clubhouse. You have to have the glue guys, even if they are maybe your worst hitter or your worst pitcher. I know it sounds bad, but sometimes you have to gauge that. And it's why the Royals don't knee-jerk reaction to guys struggling in April. I mean, look at Hunter Renfroe. Since May 1st, he's been better than expected. He really had one bad month of the season. Since that, he's been really good for 50 games. And that, to me, is what I think you can hope for in the first half. When you get to the second half, if a guy still doesn't have it, you can't have a spot anymore. And I was vocal about that in the Tampa Bay series. Carlos Hernandez came on. He was in long relief, and he didn't look good at all. And since the second half of last year, Carlos Hernandez has not been a good pitcher. And I was very blunt with it. The Royals are going to be a playoff team. Carlos Hernandez can't have a spot. I don't speak to Carlos Hernandez on a daily basis. He seems like a great guy, but it is the big leagues. And you have to give spots to guys who are more deserving. Lo and behold, the next day, Carlos Hernandez went back down to Omaha. Walter Pennington comes up. I'd love to see Walter Pennington more, and I'm sure that we will. So we'll likely see him more in the second half. But he kind of took that spot from Carlos Hernandez. I look at this bullpen, and I look who's in the high leverage spots. They're not getting rid of John Schreiber. They're not getting rid of Chris Stratton. They're not getting rid of James MacArthur. They're not getting rid of Angel Serpa. Those guys are safe. Will Smith, he's been okay. I don't think I'm moving on from Will Smith. I don't remember the last time Nick Anderson came in a high leverage role. And I thought Nick Anderson was going to be a lot better than he was. And every time he has a clean inning and he's throwing 95, 96, I want to believe a little bit. But that's where you, I guess, ask the question. Do you just leave him there because he's throwing in the ninth inning when it's 7-2? I mean, do you really care who throws in that spot to get 3 outs when you're down 5? So maybe you hang on to Nick Anderson and down the road he gets on a hot streak and you could use him in the 6th inning or the 7th inning. I look for the offense. I look at the bats. I do not believe there is a need to have Adam Frazier, Garrett Hampson, and Nick Lofton on the same roster. I don't believe that you should have 3 super utility guys. It worked for a little bit. Nick Lofton has had a really, really bad stretch. Adam Frazier's had a really bad stretch and had an injury. Garrett Hampson, he's got speed. He plays multiple spots. He's actually a plus defender in some categories. But I don't think you need to have 3 utility guys. To me, the odd man out would either be one of the righties, because you might want to have a righty and a lefty off the bench. But if I'm going purely off numbers, I think I'm okay to move on from Adam Frazier. Maybe you are the Garrett Hampson guy who wants him gone because of his base running blunders, and he only hits singles, and he tried to bunt 3-0 in Colorado when the Royals were down 2 and it was 1st and 2nd. Everybody's got their reasons. The Royals don't need to be serious about how they want to construct this roster in the second half. There is no more hoping and praying that guy turns things around to a great level. I mean, I'm looking at the bench too. I think you can make minor moves. You don't need to demote somebody that's starting every single day. Like maybe a couple weeks ago, a couple months ago, MJ Melendez would have been the easy target, but now he's hitting better than he has basically all season. You're not going to move on from him now. Kyle Isbell, same thing. Hunter Renfroe, same thing. Not moving anybody else from the starting lineup. I know Michael Garcia had his struggles. They don't have a good replacement for him unless they are going to go out there and acquire somebody else to play third base. And I don't think I would truly like that move. Massey's not going anywhere. Vinny's not going anywhere. Salvi and Freddie are behind the plate. We get the routine with that. But there are minor moves that the Royals could make that result in somebody getting DFA'd or sent back to the minors. I mean, Nelson Velasquez is at a nice little reset down in Omaha. His OBP is north of 400. His walk rate is above 16%. Maybe down the road in August and September, you see him back because you want power off the bench and not 3 guys that are super utility guys. Don't give you much power. You know, I don't know what the Royals are truly thinking on roster moves, whether they're eyeballing a guy to trade for. But if they trade for somebody, somebody has to be the odd man out. Whether it be a bullpen arm they acquire or a bat they acquire, somebody's got to be moved out. And I think you have to be strategic about who you're moving out. Do you acquire somebody like a Tommy Pham or a Jesse Winker and demote Nick Lofton back to the minors? Or do you just cut bait with Adam Frazier or Garrett Hampson? Those are kind of the guys that are on the chopping block offensively. Dairon Blanco, maybe, but he gives you speed off the bench and can swipe bags. In the bullpen, yeah, you could ask the hard question about Will Smith if you get a better lefty in there. The Royals had to send Walter Pennington back because they had too many lefties. Would you rather have Will Smith or Walter Pennington? I know a lot of people that would prefer Walter Pennington, at least fans. I'm not talking about organization members. No, Nick Anderson. Would you rather have a guy you go out there and acquire and move on from Nick Anderson? If he's not going to throw in high leverage roles, you need a high leverage guy. Those are the moves and the decisions the Royals are going to have to start making here in the next few weeks. We're about 3 weeks away from the trade deadline. It's been quiet from the Royals, but probably this week we're going to know just how aggressive they are, depending on their outcomes in St. Louis and their outcomes in Boston. We're going to take our final break of the show. When we come back, is Jazz Chisholm a fit for the Royals? We just talked about who they'd have to move out, but it sounds like the Royals could be a fit for the center fielder. We'll give you our thoughts on it. But before we do that, a shout out to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. When we come back, can Jazz Chisholm become a Royal? Do the Royals have the resources to trade for him? And does it actually make sense? We'll give you all of our thoughts on it next on Locked On Royals. You are tuning to Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson. You can always find our podcast wherever you listen to your podcast: Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Google Podcast, Odyssey, and we're on YouTube. Just be sure to hit that follow button and subscribe. Our final two sponsors today we want to give a little bit of love to, starting with Prize Picks. It's America's #1 daily fantasy sports app with over 5 million active members. It's also the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Unlike other apps, on Prize Picks, it's just you against the numbers. All you do is pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. Get in on the daily action with your friends and become part of the Prize Picks community today. And you can win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as little as 4 correct picks. You can turn $10 into $1,000. And if you're looking for promotions, Prize Picks has got you covered every week, from lowering select player stat projections on Tuesdays to help your lineup hit, or getting your entry fees back if you have a losing lineup on Fridays. Download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB for a first deposit match of up to $100. That's code LOCKEDONMLB on Prize Picks for a deposit match of up to $100. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. We also want to tell you about Tax Network USA, and we pride ourselves on getting you the latest news for your team here on Locked On Royals, whether it's the offseason, the draft, spring training, or the playoffs. It is year-round. Do you know what else is year-round? Collection season. Just because tax season is over doesn't mean the IRS will stop coming after you for unfiled taxes. The IRS can garnish your wages, levy your bank accounts, and even seize your property. Don't let the IRS target you. Let the licensed professionals and tax experts at Tax Network USA go to bat for you. With over 14 years of experience and an A+ rating by the Better Business Bureau, Tax Network USA has saved their clients over $1 billion in tax debt. Whether you owe taxes, have complicated matters that require tax planning, or finally hit that parlay this season and need help correctly filing, call 1-800-549-1000 or visit tnusa.com/lockedon. And you can also receive a $250 discount off their services if you mention that you heard them from Locked On Royals. One of the big names out there in the trade market that we recently had found out is going to be traded is Jazz Chisholm of the Miami Marlins. And it's no surprise to Royals fans that Jazz Chisholm is a target for a lot of teams out there. I think it's no surprise that the Royals have been mentioned in a potential deal for Jazz Chisholm. And I think way back when this first popped up on my feed, I didn't give it much thought. I didn't give it much reaction because Jazz Chisholm to me felt like a guy that would cost too much. He's young. He's got control. He's a big piece for Miami's future, but Miami's in a full fire sale mode. There are some guys they don't want to move on from, like Jesus Luzardo and Brian De La Cruz. But Jazz Chisholm's going to be a guy that is likely traded. Now, today, I had read an article. I think it was today or it might have been tomorrow. It might have been Monday when I put this out there. And I want to make sure that I give the right credit here when looking for this tweet. And I'm completely doing this on the fly. So I do apologize. I am trying to obviously stall on this podcast. But it was from a writer down in Miami about the thoughts of trading a guy like Jazz Chisholm to a contending team. And the Royals were mentioned. The Royals were mentioned along with the Mariners of teams that could be good fits, because for about a month or two, every time there's an outfielder available, we've heard somebody out there say, well, the Royals would be a good fit because their outfielders have been struggling. Now it's a little bit different because Hunter Renfroe's caught fire. Kyle Isbell's been much better. And then you look at MJ Melendez being pretty good in the last month or so of the season. So I don't think it's as desperate as it used to be. But still, I look at a move for Jazz Chisholm, and I'm not going to scoff at it if it meant the price was right, if the price wasn't too much. So yeah, it comes after all that searching there. If you're watching on YouTube, you saw me scrolling through Twitter as I was talking. If you're listening on, Spotify or something, you had no idea that I was even, scrolling through Twitter. But it was Craig Mish of Sports Grid and the Miami Herald reported that there's growing belief Jazz Chisholm will be traded. And Mish lists the Mariners as a club to watch, and if Chisholm is moved, and it also suggests, the Pirates and the Royals could join the bidding if he is made seriously available by Miami. We have no idea what Miami would be wanting in return. I'd imagine a decent haul might be a top 100. The interesting part of this, though, is that there's a few layers to a trade like this. So if you were to give up a top prospect, if you were to give up a Jazz Chisholm, you've heard me multiple times on the podcast say guys like Blake Mitchell, Blake Walters, Gavin Cross, Caden Wallace, I'm just not too keen on trading. Well, you look at Jazz Chisholm, he's not a free agent until 2027. I mean, he doesn't turn 27 years old until next February, so the beginning of next year. If you were to make a trade and go after Jazz Chisholm and mortgage away a prospect or two, well, it's not like Jazz Chisholm's a rental. So I could see the logic, and I think he'd be an excellent fit in Kansas City. I know some of the underlying metrics aren't as impressive, and overall, I don't think the numbers are astonishing. His OPS plus is slightly above league average. He's not somebody that gets on base at a high clip, 326. That'd be good for Royals outfielders, but the defense isn't that phenomenal. He's only running the 10 home runs this year, but he has swiped 17 bags. So you kind of get a little bit of everything with Jazz Chisholm. And, maybe in the end, the return is not as much as people are thinking. It's not like Jazz Chisholm is putting together an all-star season, and he's had one all-star season in his career. I mean, his WAR on Baseball Reference is under 1. Kyle Isbell's WAR is over 1 on Baseball Reference. So if you buy into that, of the WAR aspect, and I know Baseball Reference values defense a lot more than Fangraphs does, but then you ask the question, if Miami's asking for Blake Mitchell and Ben Kudrna and Gavin Cross for Jazz Chisholm, do you pull the trigger? I don't know if you do. I did think, though, it was interesting that, Matthew Lamar of Royals Review, I've worked at Royals Review since 2018, so I'm familiar with the work that Matthew puts out there and work that a lot of the writers, the great writers at Royals Review, put out there. And one of the articles today was the Royals either need to go all in or fire sale. And I think that trading for Jazz Chisholm would kind of be an all-in move. We are trying to make a push, not only for this year, but for next year. And that's another part of this, that I'm not sure the Royals are going to trade for a rental. I said yesterday that this trade idea I have in my mind was centered around the price for a lot of it. If a guy's a rental, they're cheaper. But I think the Royals want to be good for a few years this time around, right? I mean, take Miami, for example. They made the playoffs, got swept out by Philadelphia, and then are in a complete sell mode this year. I don't think the Royals want to do that next year. So those are all things they're going to have to consider when moving toward the trade deadline this year. Maybe Jazz is involved in a trade. Maybe he's not when it comes down to the Kansas City Royals. But as for us, that'll do it for another edition of Locked On Royals and the Locked On Podcast Network. I've been your host, Jack Johnson. You can always find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. One last shout out to Locked On Sports Today. It's here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now, available on the free Fire TV channels app. Tomorrow, we'll recap everything that happened in the doubleheader between the Royals and the Cardinals. But until then, you take it easy, Kansas City.